The night pressed heavy against the woods as Claire Monroe slipped into the rusting mouth of an old ventilation duct. Rain whispered across the treetops, masking her movement as she crawled deeper into the narrow passage. Every inch scraped against her clothes, every breath echoed like thunder in her ears. Willow Creek loomed above, disguised as a wellness retreat, but hiding something far darker. Her palms were raw against the cold metal, but her grip never faltered. This wasn't just a break-in. It was a descent into the unknown, into the belly of a fortress where secrets were buried. Fear clawed at her chest, but she carried something stronger, an unyielding determination that pulsed like fire in her veins. Somewhere inside, past layers of walls and lies, waited the ghost of a man who had once shown her the stars. Tonight, she came not as a waitress, but as his daughter. The duct spat her out into silence. Claire crouched low, her breath clouding in the sterile chill of polished marble halls. The walls gleamed a shade too soft, the lighting engineered to soothe, yet every corner hummed with menace. It wasn't a hospital, it was a gilded prison, built to make human cages look gentle. Doors lined the corridor, thick oak fitted with reinforced glass. No names, only numbers, as if identity itself had been stripped away. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and wealth, the kind that buys silence. Her footsteps sank into the hush, each sound threatening to shatter her cover. She thought of the stories Harold Bishop whispered, a facility for the forgotten, a place where powerful men hid the inconvenient. Every room could be a grave of the living. Claire's pulse hammered. She wasn't here to expose all of them. She was here for one man. She moved with the patience of a predator, eyes searching each window. One showed an old woman, her face blank before a silent television. Another revealed a man curled under crisp sheets, trapped in drugged sleep. Then her breath caught. Room 113. A figure sat on the bed, hunched, sketching in a notebook with the weary hand of habit. His profile surfaced in the dim light, gaunt, lined with years, yet unmistakable. The slope of his forehead, the shape of his brow, the quiet intensity in his thin frame. Dr. Thomas Keane, her father, alive, here, within arm's reach yet worlds away. The notebook in his hand, filled with fading calculations, was proof that the fire had never left him. 10 years of silence dissolved in that instant, replaced by a storm of grief, fury, and impossible hope. The ghost she had mourned was flesh again. Claire pressed her palm against the glass, her throat aching with a sob she dared not release. The man who once carried her on his shoulders now sat broken, a shadow drained by sedation and time. His eyes lifted, cloudy, searching, failing to connect the face before him with the daughter who bore his name. For a moment, recognition flickered, then vanished into confusion. The humiliation cut deeper than any insult Victor Langston had ever hurled. This was no reunion. It was theft made flesh. A decade stolen, memories erased, the bond between father and daughter reduced to fog. She had dreamed of him embracing her, of clarity and relief. Instead, she met a stranger who carried his face, his hands trembling with fragments of genius. Claire clenched her teeth. Victor hadn't just stolen an idea, he had stolen her father's very mind. A heavy clang rattled the corridor. A metal door groaned open at the far end, spilling the echo of boots across the marble. Claire's blood froze. Patrols. She couldn't stay. She forced herself to look one last time, memorizing her father's hollow outline. With trembling hands, she lifted her phone, pressed it against the glass, and captured his face in a grainy photograph. It wasn't the reunion she dreamed of, but it was proof. Proof powerful enough to break a kingdom. Heart hammering, she slipped back into the shadows, her breath shallow, every step a battle against panic. The hum of the building seemed louder, the walls closer, the air thinner. She plunged back into the duct, dragging herself into the cold, wet night. Outside, the storm welcomed her. Inside, her father remained a prisoner. But now, she carried the image that would set fire to an empire. 2 months earlier, the world had been smaller. The restaurant was her prison then, not marble halls but velvet booths and polished mahogany. The gilded compass glittered under chandeliers, a place where money performed nightly theater, each guest a star in the ritual of power. Claire moved among them like a shadow, trained to be invisible, to smile without warmth, to obey without hesitation. The smell of seared scallops and aged wine clung to her skin, the fatigue of endless shifts grinding her youth to dust. This was her cage, laughter of men who ruled cities, whispers of deals that moved nations, and her carrying their plates as if her own dreams had never existed. But that night, the performance shifted. A man entered whose face had loomed on magazine covers, a titan cloaked in arrogance. And in his presence, the threads of her old life began to unravel.
Victor Langston commanded the room without effort. His tailored suit gleamed under the light, his investors orbiting him with sycophantic smiles. He spoke not to Claire but over her, as though she were air, ordering wine, oysters, and silence in the same breath. His gestures were sharp, his tone laced with authority that had never been challenged. To the world, he was a visionary, the man who had reshaped energy itself. To her, in that moment, he was arrogance distilled, the kind of man who looked at waitresses and saw tools, not people. As she refilled his glass, her resentment burned quietly beneath her mask. 2 years earlier, she had been on a different path, her future tied to equations and laboratories. But tonight she was invisible again, standing before the man who had unknowingly chained her life. And in minutes, the veil would tear. Langston pulled a worn leather portfolio onto the table, opening it with the pride of a king revealing treasure. His investors leaned close as he unveiled a laminated schematic, lines of elegant geometry dancing across yellowed paper. The design for the energy breakthrough that built his empire. Claire's world tilted. At the bottom corner, scrawled in fluid strokes, lay a signature she knew better than her own. The grand loop of the T, the sharp descent of the K. Thomas Keane. Her father's hand, alive on the page like a ghost. A decade of grief surged, merging with the undeniable truth. Langston's empire had roots in theft. The weight of the water pitcher trembled in her hand, but her resolve did not. The script of her life, quiet servitude and resignation, combusted in that instant. She stepped into the light of her own fury.
The sound of glass shattering cut through the restaurant like a gunshot. Water cascaded across the polished table, soaking the prized schematic as crystal shards scattered in every direction. Investors froze, their forks suspended mid-air, their polished masks cracking with unease. The air thickened with tension, silence consuming the grand room. Eyes turned, whispers flickered. Claire stood in the center of it all, her defiance exposed, no longer invisible. Langston's face betrayed the first fracture in decades, a flicker of fear, of recognition, of guilt made visible. But the moment of truth carried its own punishment. She was not celebrated for courage, she was branded disruptive, mad, unfit for her role. Humiliation swallowed her as guards closed in, as the audience of wealth and power watched her rebellion collapse into disgrace. The truth had surfaced, but the world bowed to the lie. Dragged toward the shadows of the corridor, Claire's wrist burned beneath the grip of security. But the greater pain came from the words whispered into her ear. Victor Langston leaned close, his voice smooth, venom hidden beneath civility. He promised not ruin in courtrooms or headlines, but something colder, more personal. He told her she would crawl in poverty, watching her mother waste away, with no one to believe her, no one to save her. It wasn't a warning, it was a sentence,
delivered by a man who knew power meant rewriting reality itself. His investors, unsettled, exchanged silent glances, but none spoke. Her humiliation was complete, stripped of her job, her dignity, and her shield against despair. Yet in that cruelty, something hardened. He had revealed his fear, the mask had cracked, and through it she glimpsed the cowardice of a thief.
The gilded compass swallowed her dignity whole. Restaurant manager Richard Hale, dressed in immaculate black, delivered the sentence with rehearsed politeness. She was dismissed on the spot, declared a disturbance, her record stained beyond repair. He avoided her eyes, protecting the restaurant's image while sacrificing her life. Staff watched from the corners, silent, relieved it wasn't them. The wealthy patrons returned to their meals, their gossip now enriched with the scandal of a delusional waitress daring to interrupt power. She left carrying a small box of belongings, escorted like a criminal past the same doors she had once entered with quiet obedience. The humiliation clung like a second skin, heavier than the rain outside. By night's end, she had no job, no income, and no defense against the man who had just marked her as an enemy. Yet humiliation breeds resolve. The small apartment smelled of medication and wilted flowers, reminders of survival measured one prescription at a time. Eleanor Keane, fragile in her chair, lifted trembling hands as if to hold her daughter still. Her voice, weakened by illness, carried a weight no courtroom could rival. She begged Claire to stop. She begged her not to challenge men who erased lives without consequence. The fear in her mother's eyes cut deeper than Langston's threats. It wasn't anger, it was despair, the kind born from losing a husband and now fearing the loss of a daughter. Claire's chest tightened as shame filled her lungs. She wanted to promise safety, to soothe her with lies. But the truth pressed heavier. Safety had already been stolen from them long ago. To abandon the fight now would not protect her mother. It would bury her father forever.
The attic groaned with forgotten years. Boxes lined the rafters, layered in dust and grief. Claire pried open one marked Keane work, her hands shaking as brittle tape gave way. Inside lay notebooks, worn and frayed, filled with equations and diagrams that once filled her childhood like bedtime stories. Each page bore the neat precision of her father's genius, loops and strokes alive with impossible beauty. The smell of old paper filled her chest, both comfort and torment. She remembered the nights he scribbled under lamplight, promising discoveries that would reshape the world. Her fingers traced the familiar script, proof that brilliance had lived in her home, not Langston's. But the notebooks whispered more than memory. They whispered theft, betrayal, and a story unfinished. In the silence of the attic, surrounded by echoes of a stolen life, Claire found her purpose sharpen into resolve. Beneath the notebooks, hidden in a battered folder, she uncovered the document, a legal dissolution agreement, cold in its language, final in its decree. It claimed Thomas Keane surrendered his work, signed away his genius for a meager sum. But the signature at the bottom was an insult. The loops faltered, the strokes hesitant, the elegance gone. Claire's breath caught, not in grief, but rage. This wasn't her father's hand. She had seen his signature carved in birthday cards, etched in textbooks, flowing with the confidence of a man certain of truth. This was a clumsy forgery, crafted to bury a legacy. The humiliation twisted deeper. It wasn't enough to steal his mind. They had reduced his name to a crude imitation, an erasure dressed as law. She stared at the forgery until her eyes blurred, and in that lie, she found her weapon.
Tucked within the papers, another image surfaced. A photograph, worn with age, its corners curled. Her father stood smiling, arms slung around a younger man with sharp eyes and ambitious posture. Victor Langston. They were not enemies then, but partners, comrades in discovery. The photograph mocked her with its intimacy, proof that betrayal hadn't come from a faceless thief, but from a trusted friend. Her stomach twisted as she stared at her father's grin, unaware of the knife already poised at his back. This was no story of a stranger exploiting brilliance. It was treachery born from trust, ambition feeding on loyalty. The humiliation pierced sharper now. Her father hadn't merely been robbed, he had been deceived by a man he once embraced. Claire pressed the photograph to her chest, her hands trembling. The betrayal was personal, and now it was hers to avenge. The search led to a narrow stairwell in a decaying apartment building, the smell of damp concrete filling the air. Apartment 4B bore the name of Jack Holden, once a rising star of investigative journalism. Inside, clutter filled every surface, piles of newspapers, stacks of books, maps with red strings spidering across the walls. The man himself was hollowed by defeat. Unshaven, weary, eyes dulled by years of bitterness. His career had been incinerated by the same empire she now faced. Once he had shouted truth into headlines, now he muttered cynicism into obscurity. Claire's presence barely registered, another interruption in a life of collapse. Yet behind the layers of disillusion, a spark lingered, buried but not dead. She recognized it, the hunger for justice, waiting for fuel. Holden was broken, but broken things can be sharp.
Jack Holden listened with impatience, his eyes darting between her and the chaos of his ruined career pinned on the walls. She spoke of betrayal, of stolen signatures and buried truths. He laughed bitterly, dismissing her as just another desperate voice chasing ghosts. The words cut sharper than Langston's threat. She was humiliated, not in front of elites this time, but in the dingy apartment of a man who should have been her ally. He told her she was wasting time, that her story was nothing but the delusion of a waitress who had lost everything. The door edged closed, her hope collapsing with it. For a moment she stood in silence, bruised by disbelief, crushed by rejection. But humiliation has a way of sharpening resolve. She didn't leave. Instead, she reached for the one weapon she carried that could pierce his doubt. Claire thrust the forged contract into Holden's hands before the door could close. The paper trembled between them, its false signature glaring under the dim light. Holden froze. His eyes, trained in truth though dulled by defeat, lingered on the uneven strokes, the hesitation betraying the forgery. He looked again, longer this time, his cynicism cracking. Claire's voice carried desperation, not fantasy. She wasn't here with theories, she was here with evidence. The humiliation of being dismissed hardened into defiance as she stood her ground against his disbelief. Holden's hand shook as he turned the paper, the weight of his ruined career pressing against the possibility that he had been right all along. For 6 years, the world had branded him reckless, a liar, a fool. Yet in that forged signature, he saw vindication waiting to be born again.
The photograph followed, placed beside the forged contract. Holden's eyes widened as he studied the image of Thomas Keane with a young Victor Langston, side by side, smiling, unsuspecting. Betrayal had a face now, and Holden recognized its value instantly. His apartment, once a tomb of obsession, seemed to shift with a new energy. He traced the connections on his wall of red strings, filling gaps that had plagued him for years. The bitterness in his expression gave way to something older, fiercer. The crusader was returning. Claire stood silent, watching as the fragments of his broken faith sparked to life. For the first time in years, Holden felt the weight of his instincts justified. He wasn't staring at conspiracy theory scraps. He was staring at truth, carried into his ruin by a young woman with nothing left to lose. The war room was reborn. Holden cleared his cluttered table, arranging Claire's evidence with the precision of a soldier loading weapons. The forged signature, the photograph, the notebooks, each became a blade aimed at Langston's empire.
His hands, once idle, scribbled notes furiously, linking dates, names, companies, into a web that confirmed what he had always known. Claire provided context, memories of her father's brilliance, whispers of Project Chimera, the name he once murmured as though it were sacred. Holden's apartment filled with a charged silence, the sound of two wounded lives sharpening each other into allies. The waitress, stripped of dignity, and the journalist, stripped of reputation, found purpose in their shared enemy. In that dim apartment, amidst stacks of forgotten papers and the stench of stale coffee, an alliance was born. It was not built on hope, but on vengeance.
Holden's relentless search led them to Harold Bishop, a retired technician living in quiet exile. His home was modest, filled with relics of another era, vintage radios humming faint static, shelves lined with manuals long obsolete. His hands trembled when Claire spoke her father's name, lab by men who didn't belong. Langston declaring him unstable, forging the narrative of collapse. Bishop admitted his silence, purchased with severance money and fear. The words choked from him were soaked in regret. He had watched brilliance vanish under the weight of ambition, and for 20 years he had carried the shame. Claire listened, her fury deepening. This wasn't just theft. It was abduction disguised as mercy, betrayal dressed as business. As Bishop spoke, one detail surfaced, fragile yet unforgettable. He recalled overhearing Langston mention a facility, a place hidden from sight, designed to contain those deemed inconvenient. Willow Creek. The name lingered like poison, a sanitarium rebranded as wellness, where reputations went to die. Bishop's voice cracked as he admitted his silence, but the word itself ignited the path forward. Holden scribbled furiously, cross-referencing archives, company shells, and real estate transfers. Willow Creek surfaced like a ghost on every page, masked but undeniable. Claire's chest tightened as she realized her father hadn't vanished into death. He had been buried alive in a gilded cage. The humiliation was complete. Not only had Langston stolen his ideas, but he had reduced him to a hidden patient, erased from the world. The name was not just a lead, it was a key to the prison.
The retaliation came swiftly. Claire's unemployment claim, denied without explanation. Holden's blog, hacked by invisible hands, crashed repeatedly. Her apartment door splintered one evening, belongings scattered, her father's notebooks rifled through while valuables remained untouched. It wasn't theft, it was a warning. The message was written not in words but in intrusion. We see you. Stop now. Fear lingered in every corner of her life, in the silence of her mother's trembling breaths, in the flicker of Holden's failing laptop. Yet fear became fuel. The deeper the shadows stretched, the sharper her resolve grew. Langston wasn't defending innocence, he was tightening the leash of power, lashing out because cracks had formed in the empire he built on lies. For Claire, the intimidation was not a deterrent, it was confirmation that she was getting close. And in her humiliation, she found her weapon sharpened further. Eleanor's hands trembled as she clutched her daughter's wrist, her fragile voice echoing through the dim apartment. She pleaded for surrender, begged Claire to walk away before Langston consumed her the way he had consumed Thomas. The plea came not as weakness but as love, raw and desperate. The sight of her mother's frailty, her breath, labored from illness, struck Claire with guilt heavier than any loss of dignity. She wanted to protect her, to promise safety, but safety was a lie built on silence. Her humiliation deepened, torn between duty to her mother's plea and loyalty to her father's ghost. Eleanor's eyes shimmered with fear that history would repeat itself, that Langston would erase daughter as he erased husband. Claire turned away, not out of defiance, but necessity. To protect her mother, she would first have to destroy the man who had stolen everything. The rain pressed against the apartment window, as Claire stared at the forged signature again, her reflection merging with her father's stolen name. Her humiliation transformed into iron.
The waitress who once carried trays had been stripped bare, her dignity shredded, her safety crushed. Yet beneath that ruin, something indestructible had awakened. She whispered into the silence, not for her mother, not even for Holden, but for herself. This would not end in silence. Langston could erase paychecks, reputations, even years of a man's life, but he could not erase the truth forever. Every humiliation had built a wall inside her, brick by brick, until her resolve was unbreakable. She would enter his fortress. She would face his empire. She would take back her father. And when Langston finally fell, his humiliation would be written in chains, broadcast for the world to see. Holden found it buried in county archives, plans for the facility's original construction. Blueprints, yellowed and fragile, revealed an oversight. A forgotten ventilation duct, wide enough to crawl through, hidden behind overgrowth. Too insignificant to be updated, too old to register in Langston's web of cameras and sensors. It was a blind spot, the kind only desperation uncovers. Holden's hands trembled as he traced the line with his pen, the first real crack in Langston's fortress. Claire studied it, committing every turn to memory. It wasn't a path of safety, but a chance, slim and merciless. The duct became their weapon, the plan their gamble. For Holden it was strategy. For Claire, it was destiny. Her humiliation had brought her here, but this was no longer about shame. This was about rescue. She would crawl through the dark to bring light back to her father.
The night was starless, the forest swallowing light. Rain-slicked branches slapped against Claire's face as she crept toward Willow Creek. Holden's voice crackled in her earpiece, calm but tense, reminding her of the 30-minute window before patrols circled back. His rental car sat hidden a mile away, antenna rising like a sentinel against the storm. Claire's clothes clung to her skin, her heartbeat loud enough to betray her position. She moved like a shadow, driven not by courage, but by necessity. Every step whispered the same thought. Failure meant erasure, not just of her, but of her father forever. The facility loomed above, its lights glowing warm and false, a haven for those who paid to hide their unwanted truths. Claire crouched by the overgrown grate, tools in hand. She wasn't breaking into a prison. She was breaking into a mausoleum of the living. Inside the duct, air stank of rust and neglect. Metal scraped her palms as she dragged herself forward, Holden's voice counting minutes in her ear. Emerging into the basement, she moved through dim tunnels where pipes groaned with unseen life. The stairwell led her into polished silence, sterile and cruel. Room 113 waited like a tomb. Her father sat hunched, sketching slowly, lost in a fog of years. Claire pressed her trembling hand against the glass, whispering words he could not hear. His eyes, clouded, flickered faint recognition before slipping away. Tears blurred her sight, but her hands lifted the phone, capturing his face. The shutter clicked, the proof burned into memory and device alike. A clang echoed behind her. Patrol. Panic surged, but she fled, dragging herself back into the duct, the photograph clutched like a weapon forged from grief and resolve.
Holden worked feverishly, piecing evidence into a story sharp enough to pierce the world. The photograph of Dr. Thomas Keane, the forged contract, Bishop's sworn testimony, woven together into an exposé that detonated across the globe. Published under a respected masthead, the article spread like wildfire. Where is Dr. Thomas Keane? Became the question on every tongue. Coleman Industries stock plummeted before the opening bell, billions erased in hours. Reporters swarmed Langston's headquarters, cameras camped outside Willow Creek. His carefully sculpted image cracked as his denial stumbled into anger. The humiliation was no longer whispered in back rooms, it was screamed from headlines and broadcast live. The empire that once silenced journalists and buried truth now crumbled beneath the weight of its own theft. For Claire, watching the storm unfold, it wasn't victory yet. It was the beginning of a reckoning that could not be undone. The raid came swiftly. Federal agents stormed Willow Creek, their boots pounding through its sterile corridors. Room 113 opened not to silence, but to liberation. Thomas Keane, weak and dazed, whispered his name with clarity as they carried him into light. Cameras captured the image of Victor Langston hours later, dragged in cuffs from his private jet. The man who once ruled industries now stumbled, hair disheveled, sweat streaking his face, his empire collapsing in real time. Investors abandoned him, headlines carved his legacy into shame, and the world watched his humiliation broadcast in chains. Claire stood at her father's side in a secure hospital, holding the hand of the man she had found again. She was no longer a waitress erased from silence. She was the daughter who had reclaimed her family's name, while her enemy's name drowned beneath disgrace.